We're talking today with Bruce Burkel of Jenison, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Bruce, begin at the beginning. In what year were you born?
Born 6/5/49, June 5th, 1949.
And where were you born?
Bay City, Michigan.
All right. Did you grow up there or did you move around?
Pretty much my whole life has been in Bay City up until I turned 18.
Okay. All right. And what did your family do for a living when you were a kid?
My father worked for General Motors. He was at one of the GM plants in Saigon, Michigan.
Mm-hmm. All right. And did you finish high school?
My father did, yes. My grandfather even did. Mother did not.
Okay. But did you finish high school?
I finished high school,
And
yes.
when did you graduate?
67.
Okay. And what did you do after you got out of school?
I went out to California for a little while, a couple months, spent out there. Came back home, ran around a bit, didn't do much. A friend of mine and I sitting around talking said, you know, we ought to just go into service. We did.
Okay. Now, did you kind of enlist regular Army or did you volunteer for the draft?
I volunteered for the draft.
Okay. And why did you do that rather than regular enlistment?
I don't know. It just seemed like the thing to do at the time.
Okay. Well, how much did you know about Vietnam at that point?
Very little. Didn't know very many guys that had gone or been there. It was just, I don't know, just sitting there saying, okay, let's go do this.
All right. So when did you do that?
I think I did it in the first part of January, 68. And that didn't take very long, and I was in the service by middle of January 1968. They pretty much took you right away.
All right. And then did you go for physical at that point?
We went down for physicals in Detroit.
And do you remember anything about the physical?
A lot of lines. Bending over, but no, not really. It was a pretty cursory physical. They checked mainly, do you have flat feet, can you see, and can you hear?
Right. Did you notice anybody trying to beat the system or get out of it?
No, not that I can really remember. You know, it probably would have been me, you know, thinking I was drinking before I was going to have diabetes, but nah, that didn't work either. So.
Oh, well. Okay. Yeah, because sometimes people say there were various scams and tries to get out of going, but you weren't really worried about any of that stuff. You just went where they told you.
Yep.
Okay. So where do they send you for basic training?
Fort Knox.
Okay.
So I guess, yeah, we spent, what, 2 months in Fort Knox.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And describe a little bit what happened there. Once you arrive, what do they do with you?
It was, you know, it was interesting because I was just out of high school. I was physically fit. I ran track, cross country, played football, did all that kind of stuff. So basic was really easy in all regards.
Well, what about the discipline part?
That was not terrible. I mean, it was, you know, you had a sergeant that was in your face constantly. But I had a great DI. He was just a nice guy. He used to drop me down for push-ups all the time, but you know, I'd argue with him, but that was just sort of fun.
Okay, yeah. So you didn't get any sort of stereotypically sadistic sergeant or something like that.
No, he was a good guy. You know, he was there to do whatever it took. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so you had sort of eight weeks of that, and then where do you go next?
Fort Gordon, Georgia. Right at the end of basic, you get your orders for your MOS or your military school. They were saying I was going to be a grunt. Being the chicken that I am, I took an extra year to become a radio repairman.
Okay.
So I volunteered for another year. Drafted, then volunteered. So.
Yeah. So you wind up with officially a 3-year hitch, which you could have had if you
a
enlisted.
3-year, 2-month hitch. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So Fort Gordon, Georgia. Now, what was the training down there like?
It was. They had a good school. It was a newer facility. The The instructors, I think, were there to give you all the basics you needed. And again, you know, you always have formations. You always have go to here, go to there, go to do whatever. But as far as school was, the schools were, you know, 8 hours a day of learning how to fix radios.
Okay. And how much of that was hands-on as opposed to just book learning?
A fair amount of it. There was probably at least a third of it was. They taught theory, electrical theory. They taught pretty much the basics of the various radios. They never really got into real detail, but you could tear one apart.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you remember what types of radios you worked on?
Mostly was the Prick 25s.
Okay.
And the walkie-talkies.
Okay. And so the Prick 25s, those are the ones that the radio men carry around with them in the field.
And they were the ones that were stuck on Jeeps. They were the radio of choice for everybody, it seemed like.
Yeah, I mean, there were some longer range ones and things like that as well. And there was a variety they took in the field sometime that had originally much longer antenna on it that was more powerful. Did you work on those at all? Or?
Not as the usual. You know, it was, again, they were the ones that were more commonly used.
Right.
So.
Okay. All right. Now, while you were at Fort Gordon, did you get to go off the base?
Oh, yeah. They were not, after, I guess, a couple weeks or whatever, you were given leaves on weekends and stuff. So, and Fort Gordon is right there where, what, the Masters is? The Gulf?
Yeah, Augusta, yeah.
Yep. So it was right outside of Augusta.
Okay. And so when you went around there, I mean, did you, were you comfortable going around and visiting places? Or?
Yeah, there was no, at least back then, there didn't seem to be any issues with service people roaming the streets.
I guess the other thing that people sometimes will observe is just sort of the racial relations. I mean, by then, you had a civil rights movement, but I'm not sure how desegregated Augusta was.
You know, I don't recall seeing anything that specified that there was two different groups.
Yeah. Well, they might have taken some of the signs down by then. Yeah. Okay. Now, was the group that you were training with, were they mostly white?
Yes.
Do you remember anybody who wasn't white being there in the school with you?
There were several Hispanic, but that would probably be it.
Okay. Now, were most of the guys, you know, about your age, or were there some who were older?
Pretty much everybody was right around my age.
Okay.
In fact, yeah, because everybody was pretty much right out of high school. There were a couple that were older that had been in the service longer. And probably re-enlisted, so they got a different school, and there were several of those.
Okay. All right. Was that another sort of 8-week course, or was that longer?
That was almost 6 months.
Okay.
It
So
was
that's
a long
serious
school.
Okay.
Yeah, it was one of the longest ones they had.
All right. And then, so when did you finish that?
Oof.
Late in 69, or 68 rather? Or?
Yeah, it would have been pretty late in 68.
Okay. And once you completed that, what did you do next?
Went from there to, eventually got to Germany.
Okay.
It was another one of the military things where they couldn't quite figure out what to do with you. So I had multiple sets of orders before I finally ended up in Germany. And then when I did get to Germany, they still didn't know what to do with me. So I stayed in a holding company for a week or two before they finally got me to a place in Germany that wanted me, I guess.
Okay. Well, where did you go in Germany?
The town was called Pirmasens, or that's my translation of it. It was in the southeast corner of Germany. Yeah. Right in the mountain range,
all right.
Just outside of France.
That would have been southwest at that point. If you're next to France, you're in the southwest.
Okay, southwest.
If you're
it's down in the south.
Okay, all right. Okay, and what were you doing there?
That's where I was actually a radio repairman. It was a 5th echelon, so it was a total tear-down repair facility. Take them apart, put new parts in them, re-qualify them,
okay,
put them back together.
About how long did you stay there?
Almost a year.
Okay. All right. So what was life like for you in Germany?
Germany was pretty good. Yeah, I mean, you had free time. Um, you could have a car. You could pretty much do anything that you could do anywhere else. You know, they had formations and they had all the inspections and all of that stuff. So it was just short of being in the States in all essence. You know, they had EM clubs. You could go downtown. You could drive around. You could travel Europe. So it was really a pretty good place.
Okay. And did you do any traveling around yourself?
Not a lot, because I spent the first year and I said, well, okay, I got 2 more years here, or 2 years here. After the first one, I decided, well, I'm going to go home first, and then I'll spend my next vacation and travel Europe. It wasn't long after I got back, I got sent to Vietnam.
Okay. Now, the area of Germany where you were, how did they treat the American servicemen?
Really pretty good. You know, if you ever had questions, so many of the German people could speak English, and if you did run across somebody that didn't speak English, you usually could grab a 10-year-old kid and they could translate for you. So, you know, communications was not a big issue.
Okay. And they didn't really have anything against soldiers or?
Nope. At the time, there was a lot saying, don't go to France.
Yeah.
The French or France was more of an off-limits
in
type
'68,
thing.
there had been unrest of various kinds in France.
Yeah.
So, including student protests and other things like that. So yeah, that would have been quite possible. And the area, now, was the base that you were on, was it a big base, or were you relatively?
It was fairly good size, because again, it used to be an old German facility. Barracks were nice, but again, because it was a depot facility, you know, they fixed everything there. So.
But you didn't have like a large combat unit base there.
No, no, there was. At least I never even saw any combat units there. In fact, if you had to go pull guard, they'd give you a gun and no bullets. I mean, you know, nobody did much about you being there. So.
Okay. All right. Well, you think about that time you spent in Germany. Are there any particular events or impressions that kind of stood out for you?
Well, the parts that we traveled, you know, you got to go down to Bavaria and up into the mountains and stuff, and it's a beautiful country. It was just sort of a neat place to go. It was interesting to have to be sent there.
Okay. And you figured that you were going to get to spend 3 years in Germany?
Yeah.
Okay. So when did you go home?
Well, let's see. But so if I spent 14 months in Vietnam, got out.
But sometime in '69.
Yes. Yeah. It had to been the earlier parts of '69.
Okay.
Mid '69.
All right.
Parts of '69.
Okay. So you go home on leave, and then what happens from there?
Spent my 30 days at home, you know, partying and doing whatever, and then went back to Germany. Like I said, I wasn't there hardly a month, and got new orders, and the order said I'm going to Vietnam. So I went home again. I spent another 30 days at home. Yeah, it was pretty good.
Okay. And how did you feel about the prospect of going to Vietnam?
That was a little bit more concerning. Again, you know, it was one of those things, oh, you'll never go to Vietnam, you know, and I could have probably gotten out of it if I really wanted to. I'm the only surviving son, so I potentially could have gotten out of going to Vietnam if I thought about fighting it or whatever. That's what my mother wanted me to do. But, yeah.
All right. So how do they get you over to Vietnam?
Was it Fort Lewis, Washington?
That's one place they used, yeah.
We went, that was where I had to sign in. And because I didn't have experience with an M16 and playing Army other than basic, we had to do maneuvers and prep work for going to Vietnam, and then get on an airplane and
Okay. Did the prep work for Vietnam include anything about what it was actually like in Vietnam, or just the basics of using the weapon?
It was more weapons. They talked about Vietnam, and they talked more about booby traps and those kinds of things, things to look out for and things to avoid. Was probably the biggest concerns they were having is don't do this, don't go there, don't touch that.
Okay, all right. And once you get through that, then what happens?
We, like I said, got on an airplane, stopped off in Alaska, and ended up in Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam.
All right. What's your first impression of Vietnam when you get there?
Sandy. It was right on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
It looked more like a desert than it did anything else.
All right. And you get off the plane, now what happens?
Again, it's like, you would think that the Army had plans before they sent you someplace. Well, they don't. Mm-hmm. But you get there, and then it's like, well, where do you go? Well, they don't know. And then they have to filter that out. So you spend another 3 to 5 days in country figuring out what they're going to do with you again.
Okay. So how do you spend your time then?
Doing nothing, mainly. Okay. You know, they will put you in some, well, in Vietnam, you didn't even have to stay in formation, so you didn't really have to do that. Just doing nothing more than anything.
Okay. So they weren't putting you on guard duty or anything else
no,
like
not
that?
there.
Yeah. Okay. So after a few days, so where do you go then?
I ended up in a place called Phu Lam for the 1st Signal Brigade, which is the overseas switchboard for pretty much all of Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. Interesting little place. It was not very big at all, and in the middle of a swamp. And what they did is, for communications, everything sort of went through them. If you wanted to talk to anybody in the world, you had to go through them to get there. So we played on the phone a lot. I pulled guard there is what I did, because I didn't have any radios to fix.
Okay.
So I spent time pulling guard again. And like I said, I'm thinking right around 3 to 4 months there pulling guard until but that was a good place, because they had a swimming pool, and they had EM clubs, and they had sort of nice stuff, you know.
Okay. And where in Vietnam was this?
Just outside of Saigon.
Okay.
It was just right on the edge of Saigon.
And did you have, what kind of security did you have?
We were it. There was no infantry units. There was no combat units around us, mm-hmm. or close anyway. Yeah. So the security was the guys pulling guard.
Yeah. So. Okay. Now, did you have any problems?
Never.
Okay.
We were, again, pretty lucky. There was never any issues there. Like I said, we were just outside of Saigon, so mm-hmm. It was.
And could you go off the base at all? Or
oh yeah, you could go into Saigon and do whatever. I mean, you were required to come back by dark or by night, yeah. Or some time frame. But yeah, you were pretty much allowed to go off base and do whatever.
Okay. Were there rules about going into Saigon, or what you could or couldn't do?
There were. Most people probably didn't pay much attention to them, but you weren't supposed to carry guns and that kind of stuff. But most people did anyway, just because mm-hmm. you could, and nobody was stopping you. So.
Okay. And did you go in yourself?
I did.
Okay. And what did the place look like to you?
It was hectic. I don't know if you know what a cyclo is. It's a 3-wheeled bike, basically, where you sit in the front. You're the bumper. Mm-hmm. And this guy in the back's got this motor, and he's driving you through town, and he's zigzagging and swerving, and those are scary.
Some people have said there weren't any traffic signals.
I don't ever remember seeing a street light. Yeah, if you got enough guts, you go.
Okay. And did you build any kind of impression of the Vietnamese people?
They didn't, I didn't have to interact very often, but the people that you did talk to or see or what, they just seemed like people. You know, they were trying to survive just like everybody else, you know. There was a lot of trying to sell you stuff, you know, this knick-knack, that knick-knack, you know, Zippo lighters. Everybody had to have one, engraved, you know, but that kind of stuff. Flags and shirts and.
Right. Okay. All right. So you're at this base for several months, and then what happens next?
9th Infantry. They sent me orders to go down to the 9th Infantry.
All right. And where was the 9th Infantry based?
9th Infantry is south and west of Saigon, place called Tan An. And I was assigned to the headquarters company in Tan An.
All right. And what were you doing there?
There I was actually a radio repairman again. So they had a facility. This Tan An was a depot, their version of a depot facility. Big motor pool, small arms repair, that kind of radio repair, maintenance facility.
All right. And what sort of unit were you working with at that point?
At that point, it was just my dealings were strictly with the radio repair. We would get people that would bring in their radios, mainly infantry companies that would bring in their radios that were defective. They would register them, log them in, do whatever. We would fix them, send them back out to the infantry units again.
Okay. So were you in a repair company or a little platoon or detachment or? We
were sort of like a platoon. There was, I'm trying to think of how many we had a warrant officer in charge. There was a supply sergeant. There was a clerk type person, and then maybe a half dozen of us as radio repairmen.
And was that pretty much the circle that you associated with?
Pretty much, yep.
Okay. Now, when you're in these places, whether you were back at the with the brigade and now with 9th Division, are you paying much attention to what's going on in the war at all, or were you just focusing on your job?
No, we really didn't, or at least I didn't. It was and there was not good sources of information that you had Radio Vietnam, I guess, but there was not real good sources. Nobody was coming in with highlights to say, oh, by the way, we're over here doing this today. Or about the only thing you would get every once in a while is news clips from the States, which were typically wrong. But
okay. Now, was Tan An a more dangerous base? I mean, did you get rockets or mortars or things?
We got mortared, and again, we got mortared. We used to have a lot of Vietnamese help on the base. Well, they decided that was a bad idea, so they fired all the Vietnamese help that was on the base. We started getting mortars, and we got mortared pretty regularly until they hired all the people back. Then that all went away again, and then you'd only get mortared irregularly.
Okay. Did the mortars do much damage?
Well,
were they random?
Generally, it's sort of funny. They never seem to hit anything terribly important. You would think they would aim for, but whatever. But you could actually watch them setting up the mortars if you were on guard at the end of the airstrip.
Okay. Well, if you see them setting up mortars, do you call somebody?
Well, you're supposed to let somebody know, and they're supposed to go out there and chase them away because you couldn't shoot at them. Oh,
okay. So you had rules of engagement that were governing.
Yes, you could not, unless they were inside the wire, you could not shoot at them.
Okay. Sometimes you get stories at times about the Vietnamese employees on a base doing things like pacing off distances and stuff. Okay, but then yours sounds like the opposite. I mean, maybe your guys were local VC or they were connected to them. So like when they got mad that they were kicked off the base, they were more than happy to help shoot some mortars. But then if they get rehired, oh, let's just skip this. So different things in different places in Vietnam.
Yeah, I think it had to do if you were more out away in small groups, probably you would have more engagement that we didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, did they have a big medical facility at Tan An, or did casualties go somewhere else?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, we had one, but I think the real headquarters for the 9th Division was in a different facility, and I think that's where their medical facilities were.
Right. Okay. So about how long did you spend at that base doing that job?
I probably spent 4 or 5 months there at that facility. And then from there, there was a big offensive going on, I guess, between everybody. So I got assigned to go with a group of guys to follow an infantry company around. I was given a deuce-and-a-half truck, bunch of radio parts, and said, go follow those guys around. Wherever they go, you go.
Okay. And what was that like?
That was, I guess you get used to it, but it's, you know, you had nothing. I had a truck. Our living quarters was a tarp that draped over the truck, and we slept underneath that tarp. Yeah, 8 C rations.
All right. Well, was this company getting engaged in combat?
Frequently.
Okay.
I was not involved, but they were, again, I felt secure because they were all around us.
Okay.
They were our protectors.
All right. So it's like, it's not that they were up there or you were just staying behind some place with no one protecting you.
Right. No, they were our security.
Okay. All right. And so when you're deployed at night or whatever, I don't know, did you have any trouble? Did you get mortared or sniped
Every
at?
once in a while. We played cards a lot. We'd go inside the truck and play cards.
Okay.
Drink beer.
All right. And what kind of terrain were you in?
We were, most of the time, we were not in the mountains. We were more rubber plantation-y stuff. You know, the scariest parts would probably, I'd get airlifted into a APC group and be told to fix radios. That's unnerving. But
so why is that scarier than going around in your truck?
They don't load their guns. They'd go with 3 APCs, which means they got 360s.
Yeah.
And they were a pretty loose group. And they said, we don't have enough firepower here to defend ourselves, so we're not going to bother. And typically they didn't. So you hope like hell you got airlifted back out of there before dark.
Okay. All right. Now, do you know if you were still inside South Vietnam or if you were in Cambodia at that point, or no one's telling you anything?
Nobody told us anything. You had a feeling, but again, the people in charge that I saw said, no, there's a white line separating Vietnam from Cambodia. If you don't step over that white line, you're in Vietnam. I never saw a white line.
Well, that must be it then.
I must be in Vietnam.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I don't know, did you have any problem when you went out to join the APC units? Did any trouble ever happen?
No.
Okay.
Knock on wood.
So you're in some slightly scary spaces, but nothing.
Yeah,
really
again, I claim I am not a combat soldier.
All right. So about how long did you have that job then following the company around?
Right around 3 months.
Okay. And at the end of that, what comes next?
The 9th Infantry stood down, or they were going home. And in my stay when I was outside of Saigon, I'm thinking life is pretty good. There's this rule that if you have less than 6 months to do in the service, when you leave Vietnam, you get let go. Well, I would have had like 8 months, and I didn't want to go back to Germany, and I didn't want to be stationed in the States, so I extended to stay in Vietnam 2 extra months.
So why was staying in Vietnam preferable to Germany or the States?
No formations. less, you had more, oh, I don't want to say freedom, but there was, you didn't have to shine your shoes. You didn't have to have a press uniform. You didn't have to stand formation. You didn't have inspections. There was a lot of,
Okay. So not as much Mickey Mouse stuff.
Right.
Okay. So that and actually, and since your tour had not been particularly dangerous to begin
Exactly,
with.
especially the first one.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, this is gravy work.
Yeah. Okay. So now the 9th Division stands down, but you're still in Vietnam to finish out your tour.
Right.
So where do you go next?
11th Cav, so, and back to pulling guard.
Okay.
So I spent another month pulling guard for the 11th Cav.
All right. Now, what kind of unit? I mean, when we call it a cavalry unit, what does that actually mean?
It's APCs, mainly. Now, I didn't see that they had any tanks, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised that they had some.
They had some.
But I don't know that I was ever truly exposed to them.
Right.
Again,
mostly it's armored cavalry,
Yeah.
basically armored infantry, really.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. All right. And what were they involved in much combat or just patrolling?
I have no idea. Nothing ever happened there.
Okay.
It was rabbits out, at night and stuff. You could see them on a starlight scope, but other than that, we never had any activity there.
Okay.
And we were just a little bit north and west of Saigon then. So.
All right. So things were relatively quiet in the
Yeah.
area you were in. Did your unit move around much, or?
The infantry company moved around a lot. We had a lot of different locations. Had some underground, had some that actually had a building every once in a while, but nothing permanent. We were constantly moving, sometimes a tent. When we were close to Vietnam, it was a tent. We were next to a Green Beret unit.
Okay. But when you were with the cavalry unit, you didn't move around?
No.
Okay, just kind of.
No, it was purely a headquarters guard duty. Go stand in that tower overnight.
Okay, so they didn't need you as a radio repairman or anything
no.
else like that. You sort of do that. Okay. Now, during your time in Vietnam, did you get an R&R?
I did not take R&R.
Okay. Why not?
I don't know. It just never arose. I don't know why. Well, you couldn't at that time. You couldn't get to Australia, and I didn't really want to go to Bangkok. So, and Hawaii was out. So the two places I would have preferred to go, I couldn't go anyway. So.
Yeah, and part of your problem might have been because you moved around so much, you didn't sort of get seniority within any given unit to get on top of the list and get to go to Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, I never stayed any place long enough.
All right. So look back across that time you spent in Vietnam. Are there any particular incidents or impressions or things that stay with you that you haven't brought into the story yet?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it was, in all honesty, it was pretty mundane. It was,
Yeah. Well, that's part of the point of doing these interviews is you can't assume that because somebody went to Vietnam, they experienced X, Y, or Z.
Right.
And it will vary a lot from one to another. With the units that you were with, did you notice any drug use?
Oh, there's two groups of people in Vietnam. There are alcoholics and there's druggies. And usually the two never really cross boundaries too much. I drank.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of drugs in use, but there was.
All right. And another stereotype about Vietnam has to do with racial tensions. I mean, when you were with the combat units or whatever, did you ever notice any of that? Or?
It was there. It was interesting in a way that because of, if you happen to see a convoy or a group go by, if you were white, it was a peace sign. If you were black, it was a
Black power?
Black power sign. But you gave to both because both were fighting. So at least I didn't find it being offensive.
Yeah, but you were not just in situations where there were any real issues.
No.
As far as that stuff went. Okay. And then when talking about drugs, so as far as you could tell, there weren't like hard drugs going around? Or
When I was in Fulham, or just outside of Saigon. That was more prevalent there.
Okay.
Because there would be times as security you would have to go pick somebody up. And a lot of times they were more than on just marijuana. And so, yeah, there could be straitjackets involved. And
okay. So I guess close to Saigon there might have been more of a variety of things
yeah,
available.
Right.
Okay.
Although everything was available, it didn't matter where you were at in country. I don't care how far out in the woods you were, there would be somebody driving up on a bike with cold beer.
All right. And I don't know, was there prostitution going on around you? Or?
Oh, yeah. There's, you know, again, it's there.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
That was one of the things they said to avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah. They tell you scary stories about what can happen to you. Yeah. Okay. So when do you leave Vietnam?
October 70.
Okay. And what's the process for getting you home?
It was, again, I'm trying to think of where I flew out of, but I flew a commercial plane. And you sort of walked by and you threw everything that you had in these bins, and you had a uniform on yet. You got on an airplane and we flew into Oakland, I think.
Okay.
And they give you a brand new uniform, and I mean, you're not there very long. I don't think we spent the night there even. It was go through, get a new uniform, get a shower, get a new uniform, and tell you where your flight is to get you home.
Okay. Now, when you went out, did you fly home in uniform?
I did.
Okay. And did you have any issues with that?
I did not.
Okay.
I was under the influence most of the flight, so I don't really remember an awful lot of it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it would be, the problem would be protesters in the airports or things like that.
Right.
And that seems to vary a lot just from one person to the next what was happening there. Okay. So what do you do when you get home?
Nothing for a while. Didn't do much of anything. Then after, I don't know, maybe a month of doing nothing, then you got to go get a job.
Right.
You got to think about what the heck you're going to do with the rest of your life. So I was fortunate. I got a job working for General Motors and started school. So I went back to school.
Okay.
Went to school during the day and worked at General Motors in the evenings.
Okay. And did you complete a degree that way?
I did. I went to, I spent almost 3 years at the junior college working, and then I finally went up to Lake Superior State College, University, and got my engineering degree.
Okay. And then did you go on to a career in engineering? Or what
I
did you do?
did. From there, I went to McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company and worked for them.
And how'd you wind up in Grand Rapids?
Work. I started out in St. Louis with McDonnell Douglas, and the climate was terrible for our son. He had sinuses pretty bad, so he had nosebleeds, and it hot, humid. So I transferred up to McDonnell Douglas Electronics Company, which had a facility in Grand Rapids. I transferred over there, spent a couple more years there, and then changed jobs again, about every 3 to 5 years. Had to change a job because it get boring. Went from McDonnell Douglas to Bell and Howell or Lytton and built automatic guided vehicles. From Bell and Howell went back to Saginaw, back to our hometown almost, and worked on monorail systems and AGVs, or automatic guided vehicles. And then came back to Grand Rapids and worked for what used to be Mannesmann on their automatic guided vehicles.
Right.
And Mannesmann purchased Rapistan, and so I went to Rapistan, and we've changed names about 1,000 times since then, but that's who I retired from.
All right. So if you look back at the time that you spent in the service, how do you think that affected you? What did you learn from it?
I think I became more, I don't want to say critical, but I became more conservative than I used to be as a younger person. I guess I'm hardcore. I'm on the right.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So you kind of a reaction against the whole counterculture thing going on back home.
Yeah. You know, I guess, again, because I probably wasn't a combat soldier,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't exposed to what they had to go
Mm-hmm.
through. I didn't see, or, you know, I felt as though that when we left Vietnam, we left it wrongly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we didn't go to win. Let's play it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And when we left abruptly.
Yep.
and I sort of negative against Vietnam is the fact that if they really didn't want to be with the North Vietnamese, they would have fought that a little harder. But again,
yeah, and of course, from where you were, I mean, there's not. You kind of saw what was in front of you and what around you, and you focused on that.
Right.
And so
yeah.
the much bigger questions of why are we there in the first place, all that kind of stuff was not.
Yeah, it wasn't. You know, after you understand sort of why we were there, sort of.
Sort of. Yeah, we're still working on that.
Yeah. It's sort of like why we shouldn't have never been in Afghanistan or.
Do you think you got any other kind of people skills or matured or whatever during that time?
I think you grew up. You know, I look at a lot of younger people today, and the thing I think they're missing is the ability to cope. They don't know how. And if you're thrown in situations like that, you pretty well better learn to cope, or you're going to come home with some real issues. And so I don't think I learned to cope. It's more.
All right. Yeah, I mean, did you have any kind of issues to transitioning to being a civilian again?
Not really. The only thing that I had was loud noises. I was at General Motors, and I was working on the third floor of a building, and my job was to test power steering hoses. And how you test a power steering hose is you put pressure in them and dunk them under water to see if they bubble. Well, sometimes they blow up. I was out in the parking lot before I realized where I was at. Mm-hmm. It blew up.
So that's your little bit of PTSD,
yes.
that reflex action
yes.
kind of thing.
I still don't like loud noises. But.
All right. Okay. Well, the whole thing makes for a good story and a different one from what I usually get. So thank you very much for coming in and sharing it
No
today.
problem.